just a tad bit more attention to Islam. Again, questions. In general, I propose, I do not dispose. True story. Even that has its limits with some of mine at Carroll, as I'm sure Catherine could tell you. Sometimes you need to dispose. But in the main, I try not to do that. I also want to say two things. To be an advocate for an end to the fighting and for justice to the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank is not to be pro-Hamas, and to be critical of Israel's stance and the way that they have handled the situation, especially in Gaza where the death toll is about 29,000 people, is not to be anti-Semitic or anti-Israel. So everybody takes a beating. Fair. Everybody takes a fair beating. I also want to mention that the one group that doesn't ever seem to get talked about in the region is the Christian community. There is an Orthodox church in Gaza that has been under siege. And we need to keep that, I think we need to keep that in mind. So of course it all began with one man, two women, and two sons. And what I find interesting, and many of us know the story, right? Abraham, Sarah was at first barren. And she so wanted Abraham to have a son that she said, take my slave Hagar, have a son. And sure enough, a son was born, Ishmael. And then Sarah found that she was pregnant also with a son, and Isaac, and now we have a problem. In the Middle East, they practice the system of primogeniture. So who's the oldest son now? It's Ishmael. So there is tension. I think tension's the right word. There is tension between Sarah and Hagar. So she flees out into the desert. And if you go to Genesis, and these are the chapters in Genesis, what you find is that God made a promise to Hagar that he would make her descendant Ishmael, his descendants as many as the stars in the sky. That sounds very familiar, because God also promised that to who? To Sarah and Abraham. So Ishmael and Hagar end up in what is today Mecca. God sent them to a well, the well of Zamzam, led them with a cloud, Gabriel. My personal favorite, if you need somebody to get somebody somewhere or a message delivered, Gabriel's your angel. And patron saint of the Postal Service. Allison, yes, I just wanted to say that. And they're rescued by a nomadic tribe. Again, they end up in Mecca, and that becomes the foundation of Islam many millennia later. And Isaac, of course, we know the story of what happened. And again, if you want to read more about it, that's the biblical reference that you need. No question. I'm never that clear, people. Never that clear. Oh, here's the other thing I want to point out. So this is the Western Wall, right, in Jerusalem. The men's side and the women's side. So about 2 or 3 times ago when I was there, a group of women had launched a protest. Because the women's side is much smaller, but we seem to have way more prayers than the men. So what you do, every time I go, I take people's prayers on a little piece of paper, and you put them in the Western Wall, and then the rabbi comes by every day or so and takes them and burns them as an offering, which is just lovely, I think, right? So, I'm there, and I've got a bag of prayers. And these women were finally just so unhappy that they staged a protest and to get in on the men's side, or at least get the barrier moved. And it was this huge kerfuffle, and from what I understand, they're still at it, although nothing has changed. If you go to, some of you have been to the Holy Land, I know you have, so you can just jump right in here. If you've been to the Basilica of the Annunciation in Nazareth, you have seen all the countries that contributed their images of Mother Mary. And it's just absolutely profound. So all these countries in the world have sent in how they see Mother Mary, how they envision her, and it's just absolutely beautiful. So that's a little bit blurry, but I have it on another slide as well. But if you get a chance, do go see the images of our Mother Mary. And if you travel just a little bit further afield to the city of Hebron, where Abraham also ended up, imagine that. Ostensibly he is there buried there. This is the Ibrahimi Mosque. Well, it's actually half a mosque and half a synagogue. Again, it's in Hebron. If Jerusalem is the most contested city and the most contested place on earth, Hebron is a close second. I love them both with a sort of inordinate amount of joy. And Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, most of the patriarchs are buried there, except for Rachel. And Rachel, who died in childbirth, is buried at Rachel's tomb, which is the checkpoint. Now it's a checkpoint. That would probably not make her too happy. Between Israel and the West Bank. So anyway, there you are. So Muhammad, born in 571, to a father who was a merchant who tragically died before he was born. His mother died a short time after when he was like a toddler, and he went off to live with his uncle. And his uncle was a merchant and taught him his trade. And so that when Muhammad grew up, he went to work for a wealthy widow. Her name is Khadija, and became her caravan master. And when Muhammad was in his mid-20s and she in her 40s, they married. So good job, Khadija, well done. And he helped raise her children. Only one of them would go on to have children of their own, Fatima and Ali. Ali was Muhammad's cousin and also his son-in-law. And after Muhammad's death, which I'm really not going to go into, unless you have a question, in which case I'll answer it, the split between the Sunni and the Shia. So that's kind of how that happened. Muhammad starts at about 610 getting visits from, all together now, Gabriel, telling him to recite, telling him to write what I tell you. First time? Yeah, right. Muhammad was in a cave. He was trying to get away from all the people who wanted something for him. He was considered a very well-respected man, a great negotiator, just a very important person in the town of Mecca. And he would sometimes escape to a cave called Hira to get away from people. I'm sorry, Andy, am I out of
You're grand.
So, okay. To get away, and suddenly this angel appears and starts talking to him about revelations from God. Now, come on, right? So Muhammad, of course, he runs away, like thinking it's a jinni, right? The jinn, a jinni is after me. And this goes on for a while until, ostensibly, or how the story goes is that Gabriel wrestled him to the ground and said, "You're not going anywhere, and now you're going to just listen." And he did, and over time became convinced. And the first person he told was his wife Khadija. She was still alive at the time. And off they went, and she said, "Oh, I think you might have something there." And she took him to her cousin, who some scholars say he was a Christian. I might quibble with that. I think he was just very well versed in Christianity, because both Mecca and Medina had Jews and Christians living in them. Wadaka, and he was telling his story to this cousin who was very knowledgeable in Christianity, and he said, "Yep, you probably better listen, because I don't think that God will take too kindly to this." And so from 613, he starts to share his visions in 613 up until his death in 632 CE. And what we learn about, or what the if you read the Quran, you find it's not a narrative, right? We're looking for a narrative. My students tell me all the time, "Well, where's the story?" Give it up. It's not like the First and Second Testament. It's not a story. But there are some very familiar people there. Moses, Jesus, called Isa, Yahya, John, Noah, Mother Mary. She's the only woman in the Quran to have a whole chapter named for her. Of course, because who doesn't love Mother Mary? Give me a break. And so what we find out over time and over the series of these revelations, Gabriel has to appear to Muhammad because God cannot be seen or heard. Has to work through an intermediary. Has always existed. Rewards, but also punishes. Is merciful, and on we go. All things that sound, I think, really, really familiar to both Jews and Christians. And the 5 pillars, which some of this might also be familiar for people that pray the hours or whatever. The first one is prayer 5 times a day. The story goes that Muhammad made a visit to God called the Night Journey. And that God started out at like 40 prayers or something. And Muhammad was like, no. Like, your people are not going to do that. That's just not the thing. I'm sorry, that's not a thing. And then after a protracted and complex negotiation, they got it down to 5, which everybody seems to be able to live with. So good news there. So pray 5 times a day. Give zakat or alms. It's not a tithe. It's not an official 10%. It's what you can afford. The shahada, which is the profession of faith. La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. There is no God but God, and Muhammad is the prophet of God. Make the Hajj 1 time in your life if you are physically and financially able, and fast during the 30 days of Ramadan. Have I done it? Oh yeah. Week 1, I need to be alone in a box because I'm very grumpy. No food, no water. If you're a smoker, no smoking, no sex, no nothing from sunrise to sunset. I can do no food and I'm not a smoker. No water, that's a tough one. And people go to work and they do everything. So Ramadan this year goes for 30 days. It starts on the 10th of March. So Lent, part of Lent and Ramadan will coincide at this time. And it moves back 2 weeks every year because they're on a lunar cycle. So there you go. If you want to add to your Lenten fasts, nothing from sunrise to sunset. Like I said, I've done it many times. I'm not motivated at all to do it here when I'm just here by myself and other people aren't doing it. But when I'm in the region, everybody's fasting. And I'm doing it with a happy heart. As long as you can have anything you want from sunset to sunrise. And I'm there. I have my coffee and my water. I'm like, I gotta do this before, or I'm not gonna make it. Probably especially the coffee. Any questions about that? And then there's some more Mother Mary. This is my image of peace in the Holy Land right here, right? So these are my friends from New York. The husband, Meg's husband, is actually taking the picture. That's Meg and their 2 children. They're Jewish. Here's me, a little Christian, and that's my friend who's Palestinian Muslim. So we are peace in Gaza right there. What can I say? Jesus, again, in Arabic, Isa, is a prophet of special significance, greater than Muhammad. God's greatest prophet is Jesus. Muhammad is simply the last, sent first to the Arabs, and then to the entire world. And the special place of Mary. Muslims accept the virgin birth. And it says in the Quran, Isa, or Jesus, born of the Virgin Mary, born of the Virgin Maryam. Oh yeah. When people are talking too loudly in the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, my friend, this one right here, you can probably tell he doesn't have a calm and tranquil personality, will go up to them and say, you need to be quiet and you're being really disrespectful right now. Like, it's okay. Well, does that offend you? Right now, you just need to get a grip. So, and I think that all of this raises, this is Mount Nebo, for any of you know, Mount Nebo in Jordan. That's where Moses looked into the Holy Land and knew that he would never enter, right? This is actually from an old Roman, they've done a lot of archaeology up there. This is from an old Roman temple, so that dates back to the Romans. That's the most Roman mosaic. But anyway, all of this begs a really important question. If there are all of these commonalities, what happened? There's a diarist, Wasif Jawahiri, who wrote in the 19th century about his life and about his experience living in Jerusalem, what is today the old city of Jerusalem. And he talked about sharing holidays and going to his neighbors' homes who were Jews and Christians in the 19th century. And this is not his reflections. He wrote this diary when he was living it. So again, this raises, I think, a really important question. What happened? And it didn't just happen on October 7th, right? My students came to class, first day of class, right? Right hand. They have their hands in the air already, right? They're walking in. Like, I have a question. What happened on October 7th? And I said, do you mean what happened in 1914? It didn't happen then. It was building. What happened on October 7th is a symptom of what happened going all the way back to World War I. And which is why I will propose, I almost said dispose of, which is why I will propose that the situation is modern and secular. Again, it's not about God or Yahweh or Allah. It's about dirt. It's about land. It's about water. Who has it? Who wants it? Why doesn't everybody have it equally? But God does what? What does God do for us? What does saying it's about God do for us? This is, participation.
Yes.
Jeremy.
It justifies what my actions are.
It justifies our actions, and it also does what? It justifies and it also does what? How excited are we to crusade for dirt? God. It packs the emotional punch, doesn't it? God is what gets people fired up. Really, what should get us fired up are the British. No offense to anybody here who traces, is of British extraction. They behaved badly. So, World War I, all of you probably know, the Ottoman Empire collapsed in 1918, and all of its territories broke apart. They've been the hegemon, or the, kind of keeping the lid on things in the region forever, and, well, at least since 1453. I mean, they were in decline for a while, but anyway, they broke apart. And there was a scramble among the European powers for these territories. For Egypt, why? Why did why did Britain want Egypt? Thank you, the Suez Canal, absolutely. The French wanted their share of the pie, so they got what is today present-day Syria and parts of Lebanon. And the British got what was called a mandate over what we're going to call right now Palestine, which, don't worry, there's a map. Nobody panic. I have a map. And what happens is that in the inner war years between World War I and World War II, and actually even before that, there's a series of aliyahs, which means aliyah simply means going up. Because the situation for the Jewish community, especially in Eastern Europe, was dire. They were being killed by the Tsar, they were being killed by the Russians, the Poles didn't want that. It was really, really bad. So some of them were making the Aliyah and going to Egypt, or going to the Holy Land. Now this is interesting, because some of them would get there and say, oh no, this is desert, no. And they would actually go home, but a few would stay. And so that for a time, there was just enough immigration of Jews from the European from Europe that they kind of assimilated and got along with everybody, like we're newcomers, and everybody would kind of help each other out, etc. And of course, the draw of the Holy Land comes from the prayer at Passover next year in Jerusalem. Well, things are bad, and by 1939, things are worse for the Jewish community, right? They're being slaughtered. 6 million Jews, 3 to 5 million others. And so what happens is there becomes two equal but competing narratives. When World War II ends, what are we going to do with people who can't go home? If you lived in Poland, can you go home? Do you want to go home? Probably not. If you lived in Germany, probably not. So there was a huge influx of immigration. In the meantime, the British are making promises to everybody. They're promising the Jewish community a homeland. They're promising the Arab community independence. It's a disaster. There's all these different correspondences, the Balfour Declaration, Sykes-Picot, the Hussein McMahon correspondence. Oh my God, my students at one point, their eyes were glazed over. But all of these different promises were made to each group depending on who the British and the French thought they needed as allies. So the land is slowly getting divvied up. The community of people that live there feel under siege. The people from Europe are like, but we have nowhere to go, etc. And unfortunately, what is born of this for some of the early leaders of what will become in 1948 the new state of Israel is a land without people for a people without a land. What's the problem with that? There's 5 million people living there.
Yeah.
Right? And so it creates this idea of an empty space. And like I said, and again, 2 competing narratives. We totally understand what's the dire situation for the Jewish people. We also are sympathetic with the Palestinians who feel that they're being moved off of their territory. That includes Christians. So the pivotal year is 1948. What happens in 1948? UN Resolution 181, the creation of the State of Israel. It was supposed to be, wait for it, a 2-state solution. Okay, I'm sorry, sometimes we have to have, And so a home for the Jewish community, a state for the Jews, and a state for the Palestinians. With a notable exception, Jerusalem. Jerusalem was meant to be a city apart. There is a Latin word for that. Do not ask me what it is because I can never remember. But it was meant to be under international control. Because that's the outside of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. If any of you have been there, you know. It's a trip. All of these different Orthodox and Catholic denominations are in there, and they can't seem to share it very well. Not good at that at all. And so, like the Armenians are over here, and then another group is over here, and I think it's the Ethiopian Coptic Church. They're on the roof, because they can't even get inside. And it's been, the doors, it's under the custody of the Franciscan order, but it's open, the door to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is opened by the same Muslim family for the last 1,000 years. And that seems to be the safest. We're not going to give anyone else the keys. So it was meant to be a city because it is sacred to all 3 of the Abrahamic faiths set apart. Nobody got Jerusalem. And actually, nobody was really supposed to get Bethlehem either. And that's not what happened. Unfortunately, the new state of Israel chose to open their parliament, called the Knesset, not in Tel Aviv, as was agreed, but in Jerusalem. So now the city of Jerusalem becomes a flashpoint. It's always been a flashpoint. If you want to have a protest, go to Jerusalem, right? And do whatever it is you do. And so it created a lot of anger, and it created a lot of animosity. So that between taking the city of Jerusalem and the Palestinians not getting a state, for Israel 1948 is independence, for the Palestinians it's called the Nakba, or the catastrophe. How are we doing? Are we good? Is it clear? Okay. So this is what has happened. I wonder what plenty of time for. All right. So you can imagine, nobody's happy, right? The Palestinians and the states around them are attacking Israel. Israel is attacking back. Tensions mount and mount and mount. So that in 1967, they go to war. This is the partition plan from 1948. This is what it was supposed to look like. Palestine, a little land bridge here in Gaza, the Palestinian state, this Israel. And nobody was supposed to transgress those boundaries. No settlers, no moving it, no nothing. Everybody just get along, and this is what you've got. Well, what happened in 1967 is that outgunned, Israel made a massive land grab that included the territory west of the West Bank, the territory west of the Jordan River, which was nominally controlled by Jordan, the Gaza, the Sinai, which ultimately went back to Egypt in 1973, and the Golan Heights, which belonged to Syria, which today Syria calls occupied Syria. Israel calls it the Golan. My scarf comes from Druze women. It was made by Druze women who live in the Golan. Took this land grab. So what has happened, and then slowly started moving people into the territories that were predominantly Palestinian. Keeping in mind that there's a really good book, and if any of you want to read a really interesting book, it's called The Lemon Tree. It's by the journalist Sandy Tolan. And it's about a house and a lemon tree. And it starts with the story of Bashir and his family, Palestinians, who in 1948 were forced to leave their home, and the home was given to Dahlia and her family, who were Bulgarian Jews and survivors of the Holocaust. And ultimately they meet. And they each tell the story of this house and what it meant to them and what it means to them. And Terry Gross interviewed both of them on Fresh Air a number of years ago as well. So if you're interested, my students read it. They're reading it right now. It's really fantastic, and they talk about hope, really, and that if you plant a lemon tree, which Bashir's family did, it takes a long time for lemon trees to produce fruit, and it's a sign of hope for the future. So what happens is that there's this land grab. The leadership at the time is Fatah, founded by our good friend Yasser Arafat, Nobel Prize winner. I know, my parents did not see that coming. And what happens is that they go to war again in 1978. This is actually led by Egypt this time. It looks like it's going to be a success. It's a failure, although Egypt does ultimately get back the Sinai. And what Anwar Sadat decides, also Nobel Prize winner, was we're not going to beat each other on the battlefield. This is not going to be solved. The situation in the Holy Land or in Israel-Palestine is not going to be solved on the battlefield. So he went and he appeared before the Knesset, the parliament in Israel, and made a plea for peace, saying we're just going to keep killing each other unless we figure out how to share this land or can get to a two-state solution. And one of his own people was so outraged that in 1981 he was assassinated. Yitzhak Rabin, a number of years later, did something very similar, except that he went to Egypt to make a plea for peace, and he was also assassinated by one of his own people. Some of you might remember that story. I think his widow just passed away. So the demand for a two-state solution is a withdrawal to the 67 borders. It's called the Green Line, right? It's a withdrawal to this. The problem is that now people live all over, so we have a little bit of a problem. So this gets us to the Gaza Strip. Years, 70 years, 100 years, whatever, of anger and frustration explodes, I would argue, on the 7th of October. And it's not surprising that it happened in Gaza. 25 miles long, approximately 2 million people live there. It is the world's, some people say one of, I think it is the highest population density in the world. And there is nowhere to go. Egypt doesn't want them, so they can't go here. Jordan has a lot of refugees. I don't know that they can take too many more. I've lived in Jordan. It's small. Israel, certainly not. All these places. Or the Mediterranean Sea. So that every time people are asked to move since October the 7th, where are they going to go? And now Egypt is building a wall to prevent them from coming into Egypt, the refugees. And it's important to know that Israel exercises control over Gaza's borders, waters, and airspace. And there have been embargoes. Although I have to tell you this. So, young people are incredibly entrepreneurial. So this was maybe 15 years ago. There were two brothers living in, I think, Khan Yunis, which is right here. They decided that the answer to not making any money was to use one of the tunnels dug by Hamas, which is really funny, and go into Egypt and get Kentucky Fried Chicken. So they would take orders, and they would go to Egypt, and they would get Kentucky Fried Chicken, and then they would bring it back. That is fantastic. Who knew? Halal Kentucky Fried Chicken. That's fantastic stuff. So anyway, there you are. Right now, almost all of Gaza, of course, is a refugee camp. Is a massive refugee camp administered by the United Nations. And there have long been shortages and other problems. And what happened? to throw flame, I guess, a fire or whatever. That's my daughter floating in the Dead Sea, because if you take students to the region, which I've done twice, you gotta float in the Dead Sea and you have to ride the camels. I don't float anymore, but I definitely ride the camels. Hamas was, okay, so Fatah, the former party of the PLO and Yasser Arafat, controls the West Bank. They're the authority, the Palestinian Authority, led currently by Mahmoud Abbas. Sometimes you'll hear him called Abu Mazen. In 2008, Hamas was elected as the governing authority in the West Bank, in the Gaza Strip, because the people in Gaza felt that they were not getting the same services and the same support from Fatah that they should. So they elected Hamas, which, there should be an S. Oops, sorry about that, typo. Which probably was not a great move. Because again, I'm not an apologist for Hamas. But they were democratically elected the first time. The subsequent times, not so much. But in 2008. And the world, I would argue, missed an opportunity to engage them in ways that are more constructive. If you want people to be part of the international community, you have to bring them into the international community. And you have to tell them that if you want to be part of this community, this is how we behave. And that's not what happened. And so as a result, this is what Gaza looks like today. There was a blockade for, yes?
But don't you think that the Israelis actively discouraged the community, the whole United Nations community, to engage with Hamas?
Oh yeah, actively discouraged.
It wasn't like people didn't want to or wouldn't, but the Israelis really were
Actively,
against it.
they were very against it, to the point where and they put a lot of pressure on the United States.
Right.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm talking here, when I talk about the Israelis and Hamas, I'm talking about the government. I'm not talking about the people. If you go, or when you go, I'm going to say when you go, maybe I'll work with Father Tim and we'll take a group. Father Tim will say Mass and I'll just squawk. But maybe we could work on that, right, Father Tim? We could maybe work on a tour to the Holy Land, St. Mary and the Holy Land. We went to Italy. We went to Italy, right? So we could do that. The problem is the government. And there's so much anger and animosity. Bibi is on round 2 of being prime minister. And he's under indictment, which is probably not great. And so anyway, after all of this, the blockades and all of these things, and that most recently, oh my God, I might even have to have Allison turn on the lights because, Allison, could you turn on the lights? I have to read this. This is as of the 21st of February. 29,000 people dead, 12,000 of them children. 69,000 people injured, of that 8,600 children in Gaza. Almost 400 people dead in the West Bank, 105 of them children. 1,100 people dead in Israel, 8,700 injured. Every life is precious, people, and I want to be clear, every life is precious. But 1,100, almost 1,150 is not 29,000. That is not a proportional response. There's cholera. 360,000 places where people live have been destroyed. 392 educational facilities. And at this moment, as of yesterday, 1 hospital was functioning. 1. On Wednesday, a doctor had to give a woman an emergency cesarean without anesthetic. And to make matters, I would perhaps argue, worse, this is what Benjamin Netanyahu said on the 21st of February, following the passing of a resolution in the Knesset, that Israel's position is that any accord with the Palestinians must be reached through direct negotiations. So now that's good. We're good. Except that he also stated that the Knesset came together in an overwhelming majority against the attempt to impose on us establishment of a Palestinian state, which would not only fail to bring peace, but would endanger the state of Israel. In essence, on the 21st, he said, there will be no two-state solution as long as I'm in office. Yes?
1947, wasn't it Palestinians that refused the two states?
They refused the two, you know what, that's a really interesting misnomer. They refused the two states because all the fertile land went to Israel, and they got the desert.
Thank you.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yes. There's not a lot of fertile land, man. You gotta share it. I have a friend who wrote a really interesting book called Sharing the Land of Canaan, in which he is a Christian. He's a Christian living in Bethlehem. And he makes the argument for that a two-state solution isn't fair to anyone, that what we need to do is learn to share. And I think that's a really interesting proposition. I'm like,
Well, we need to do what?
share.
Share.
Share all of it.
Yeah.
One state, everybody shares.
Dream on.
I know. I'm not, you know what? You're right. But I'm just saying, right? So now Bibi has said, I'm taking control of Gaza and we're not giving it back. And that was in a speech from the Knesset. That's a direct quote. To share. There they are. There are 21 of them.
Oh, wow.
I know. They took their banner everywhere. Yeah, that was my Carroll College students in 2019.
Cassandra's in there.
We went to Israel, Palestine, Jordan, and Egypt. And then I guess we get to the possibility of peace. I love this, make hummus not walls. This is on the West Bank side of the wall. And this, I can't take credit for this picture. I so want to, but it was taken by a friend of mine, so I just use it. The camel's going off into the sunset, but I don't know. I want to believe that we could get to peace. And I don't know. I guess I want to hear from all of you. How do we get, knowing everything that has happened, I'll tell you how I think we get to peace. I think that Abbas, the leaders of Hamas, Netanyahu, the people currently in government, they all have to retire and let the next generation take over. They don't have the anger. They don't have the hostility. They don't have the frustration. They are tired of their children dying. The friend of mine that took this picture has 6 children and 4 grandchildren. His children do not want this for their children. But the people at the top have been there so long, they can't see their way to a path. And I believe in my heart in the power of prayer. I guess my reflection would be, if there has been anything at all useful today, that you will share it with other people so that we might all come to better understand the situation and the injustice on all sides. So that is my reflection. That is my hope. Prayer is good, but education is also good. Catherine.
Jeanette, it strikes me that you started with the talking about the protest, the women protesting their limited space
Yes.
for prayer, which is ironic for so many reasons.
I know.
Just in hearing about peace movements and peace protestations, could you talk a bit about the women activists who might be a source of hope for us? It strikes me that we're hearing a lot about men in power, but a lot of times the peace is coming forth from mothers outraged. Could you speak to any of that?
I can. Thank you for asking. Because many of the mucking it up has been, unfortunately, men, I love you all. Men are 50% of my one of the, I think, best activists for peace, and she's not in government anymore, is a woman named Hanan Ashrawi. And she was actually, she's a Christian woman. Actually lives in Bethlehem. was at one time part of the founding of the PLO. And she writes quite eloquently about women needing to come to the table. What we need to understand is that the role of women is very different in many of these places, right? And so they assert a different kind of influence. The research shows that if you want a young man not to carry out a suicide attack, who will stop him? Not his wife, not his children, his mother. And if the mother finds out and is on the phone, suddenly it's off, right? And so they assert a different kind of power. I call it the culture of women. To me, the culture of women in that part of the world is powerful and profound. And to tell, aside from these Jewish women who had just had it, right, they're just done. Most women are not, some of the younger ones, that's not true. The younger ones will take up their banners and they'll do their thing. Right now, lots of women, children, families are protesting Bibi in Tel Aviv, right? They don't like what he's doing. But of a certain generation, it's a quieter kind of protest. It's a quieter kind of, let's not do that. So you're not going to hear a whole lot about them. Although there is also a very interesting, she's a feminist. Her name is Amina Wadud. And she wrote The Quran and Women. And she reads the Quran as a feminist text. I have my gender history students read it. And she talks really profoundly about my activism and my feminism because of my religion and where I grew up may look different than yours, but it's no less powerful. Does that? But again, Hanana Shrawi, check her out. She's on TikTok. And X, I think. Yeah, tell me.
You mentioned that we hear about the Muslims and the Jewish, but not the Christians. So where are the Christians in this?
They are a rapidly disappearing group. There's a huge I don't want to say huge. There's a considerable community in Nazareth. And there is a community in the West Bank. They don't say a whole lot because they're Palestinian. And so, like, my friends that are Palestinian Christians that live in Bethlehem, they have never been to Jerusalem. And it's 10 miles away. when I'm living there, I get on the bus in the morning with impunity. Like, I'm not doing anything today. I think I'll get on the public bus and go to Jerusalem. And they can't get a pass. So they are lumped in that category of Palestinian. And their movements in many ways are restricted. The only reason I'm not restricted is because I have a U.S. passport. Although I did spend 4.5 hours in Israeli detention for coming in from Jordan once.
Did you talk your way out of it?
Yeah, I did. Thank you for asking. 4.5 hours later, I'm like, yeah, well, it's when I talked about my visit with the Mossad. It's fun. You asked me that question an hour and a half ago. They did finally let me go because I just raised a fuss. But that's why you don't hear about them, because they are basically lumped into that category.
And they're very small.
And they're very small.
Very small group.
Yeah.
Jeanette, I'm thinking here, I'm kind of jumping off of Catherine's comment, but when we think about, at least in my experience in my career, women are more oriented toward relationship and men toward power. Now, that's not accusing men at all. That's culturally what's happened over the years. Is there any place for hope there, in some of the Eastern populations, for the power of relationship to somehow or another invade that power, that sense of power with the governments? Is there any place for that?
Yes, there is.
What do you see going on?
I think as women are increasingly more educated, right? Mm-hmm. They start to,
are they?
Yes,
Are
they are, absolutely. They are being educated.
Okay.
And they are they're starting to, not into their 30s, but they're starting to have children a little bit later. They're not getting married at 18 and having babies, right? Mm-hmm. They're starting their careers a little bit later, and they are raising their children in very different ways. That is not to say that the way that they're maybe raising their sons and daughters is the way I raise my daughter, but it's equally valid, right? And so they are teaching them, and they're teaching them in that relationship of this is how, because I think they see that what the men are doing, how it's being handled, isn't working.
No,
Right? And so there's a lot of recognition for maybe we need to think about doing things different. Does that make sense? Absolutely. There, women are also, and then I'll get to you. Women are also getting involved in like businesses and things that give them a little bit of autonomy and a little bit more sway.
What's happened in this, our country, right here.
Yeah.
Do you see Netanyahu as a detriment to any kind of peaceful resolution? But he seems so horribly vehement in everything that he says.
I
You
do.
see him being driven out.
I don't see him being driven out, and yet the protests in Tel Aviv especially would suggest that they don't want him anymore. Right? They're on the street, they got banners, they have their children out there, their bonfire. It's a thing. You should see. I listen to Al Jazeera both in English and then I listen to the Arabic channel. And they show a lot of these images from Tel Aviv, right? It's on fire some nights. And yet Bibi has enough of a coalition in the Knesset that support him, that see Israel from the land to the sea, from the river to the ocean, that no. But he is actively a problem, and Mahmoud Abbas of the Palestinian Authority is just not strong. Does that make sense? So you've got this, person wielding this sword of Damocles and this leader that's just not strong. Yeah.
So you give a very, very balanced presentation, one that you don't hear in the American press. Don't you think the American press has an absolute pro-Israeli bias?
Yes.
I mean, that's all we hear.
That's all we hear. And I think that that's born of, I don't even know. I think it's born of maybe intrinsic bias. I think it's also born of, this is what we understand. And nobody bothers to educate their reporters better, right? I was very, very critical of a lot of the news outlets when they didn't take a step back to say that it didn't happen on October 7th, it happened 100 years ago, right? I was super critical of that. So I try really, really, really hard to, so thank you, that's quite the compliment, because I try so hard to be balanced, and I just want them to do the same.
So everything that you read, when they report on Palestinians, it's always Palestinian terrorists.
Yes.
Always.
It's 0.1%, 0.01% of people that commit acts of terror.
But you wouldn't believe that reading the American press.
You would not. You would not. I don't know what else to say. Yeah.
So, I couldn't even quote you my sources, but just the sense that I have before listening to you today, that the Arab world largely wouldn't even recognize the existence of Israel and would maybe right out say that they want to destroy Israel. And today, what is your take on the Arab view as Israel, its right to exist and so forth? Not talking about necessarily the resources and the fairness of that, I can see that as being a very critical thing, but does Hamas recognize that Israel is there and they have to deal with it?
They do. They do. Which is interesting, because they didn't start out that way. I want to be super honest. Again, not an apologist for Hamas. They did start out. They will tell you, I'm going to tell you their narrative, right? I propose now, right? I'm not disposing. Their narrative is, land without people for people without a land. You refuse to recognize us, and we're going to repay you by refusing to recognize you. Right? Is that productive for anybody? No. But, do you see what I'm saying? But now everybody has stepped back from that, because what they realize is that we may not like what the government's doing, but the people, we're all here, we're in it together. Does that make sense?
Yes. Now, could you speak about, now Egypt is on paper with treaties, and so they have recognized Israel as a state, but Jordan, Syria,
Absolutely, they all do.
they all do.
Absolutely, they all do. One of the biggest fans of our current Pope is King Hussein of Jordan. He calls him my brother the Pope. I know, isn't that awesome? Yeah.
Considering the '67 war, now, we're talking about the press here and in the United States. I had many friends, and I was on a college campus, and we knew what was going on in our country at that time now. And they were willing to go to Israel to fight for Israel over fighting for the United States. And they were willing to go because of that, because they felt Israel was the one offended. But you were saying Israel went for a land grab?
They did. 6 days, they grabbed 5 pieces, four major
Well, I know
pieces.
they ended up grabbing it, but they've been invaded first and fought back.
There was one airstrike from Egypt that precipitated the '67 war. Again, a measured response. What would have been a measured response? And nobody's doing it. Does that make sense?
It makes sense, I was just, because of the political, or the, talking about the press,
Yes.
and what we saw, and the reaction of people I knew in college that were against the war, some were in WotC, going for officership, were willing to stop everything there and go over there and fight.
Yeah, and that's
And that was here in Montana.
yeah. There's a certain amount of, there's a guilt narrative that I can't even, I could talk to you about it forever. There's a guilt narrative about young people that live like in the United States and don't wanna go fight, because if you are born Jewish, you are automatically a citizen of the state of Israel, and if you don't wanna go fight when things like this happen, there's a tremendous amount of pressure.
That wasn't a no.
Yeah, there was a tremendous amount.
Just one more question. So I have to wonder, what do you think that the Hamas endgame was?
Okay, let me tell you just very briefly something about organizations that commit acts of terror, right? Hamas, ISIS, the Taliban, I could go on for a decade, right? They understand the attack. What they're not quite yet equipped to do is what happens on October 8th. It's the governing part that they're not quite there yet. You see what I'm saying? So effective, however you define effective, right, in an attack like October 7th and what's going on now, but not big planners for what happens next. What's unfortunate is that Bibi doesn't seem, well, he does now have a plan, but at first he didn't seem to have a plan for what happened next either. You see what I'm saying? So that is, and I'm not even sure it's a goal, right? For some of these organizations, like, okay, now we got this territory, what are we gonna do with it? Not their forte. Does that make sense?
Do you have what's your opinion
Oh, God.
about, did the Palestinian Authority organize the attack, or was it subservient commands or groups within Hamas that did the attack, and now they have to embrace it and somehow make something of it afterwards? So rogue elements.
Of Hamas? No. Absolutely not. The best of all possible worlds, until we can get to 2 states, if we even can anymore, is for the Palestinian Authority to take over governance of Gaza, because that's more acceptable than Bibi saying Israel's gonna govern Gaza. Or actually right now the UN is governing Gaza. But no, the leadership this is actually really interesting. The leadership of Hamas, way up, right, is in Qatar. And the Qataris are now trying to negotiate, everybody's in Paris right now, trying to negotiate at least a release of the hostages, right? And so, yeah, But the top brass is not even there. But they were working off of the commands of the leaders that are in Qatar. So this was not rogue. And in fact, by the best estimate is that at the least a year, possibly 2 years, and there was so much upheaval in Israel, is that they're still trying to unravel how much people knew, the government knew, because I assure you, they knew something. And the IDF, and the Mossad, especially the Mossad, which is Israel's equivalent of the CIA, they knew something was up. Did they know it was going to happen on the 7th? No. Did they know that there was military activities and things going on? They knew. And it got, nobody believed it. Yeah.
This, and I'm still trying to piece together for myself about how much and maybe I'm using the terms wrong, but is Hamas separate from the Palestinian Authority?
Correct. They
They're
are.
separate?
They're separate.
Is Hamas like a political party?
They are a political party and an organization that commits acts of.
And who was the government of the Palestinian people?
The Palestinian Authority is born out of the PLO. So the
Yes.
political branch, Fatah, is born from the PLO, which was founded by Yasser Arafat.
And then you said there was an election in '08.
In '08, there was an election for Hamas.
Okay.
And Hamas, they have a governing authority, and they have a not governing. Does that make sense?
Kind of.
Kind of, yeah.
One quick question.
I
What,
completely understand.
the Palestinian Authority, of course, is in control of the West Bank.
Correct,
And so they were not part of the invasion
correct.
on October 7th, but there are conflicts there between, and so what is the status of the West Bank right now? Where are they just kind of?
They are looking for Hamas and Hamas sympathizers in the West Bank. And so they're going into towns like Jenin and some of these other places, and they're arresting mostly young men who they believe are potential sources.
The
of-
Israelis
the
are.
Israelis
The settlements.
are. Oh, don't.
I mean, I know,
They're
I don't
illegal.
wanna go there, but it's, mostly the issue of the settlements is the West Bank.
Well, actually, it's the West Bank, and then all the places that were hit on October 7th were illegal settlements when Israel made that grab in '67.
So that was in Gaza.
Yeah, that was just outside of the strip.
Okay.
Yeah. I've overstayed my welcome, so. I will be here, sitting on my phone, if you wanna come over, I can answer more questions. I don't have more. I can go home. And cook.